Welcome to the Gritty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Call, and I am joined today by my brother, the Gritty Broman. How are you, Brent?
I'm well, thank you.
Today's podcast is about the education of a naturalist. It's about Theodore Roosevelt and his childhood. And I'm going to go over, right now you hear a lot about tearing down of statues in our there's a lot of civil unrest going on. Mm-hmm. And, there's some talk about Mount Rushmore, and Theodore Roosevelt is on Mount Rushmore. And there's discussions about the men on that mountain there. And there's one faction of the public who really wants to eliminate our history and really paint with a broad brush every person who was instrumental in our nation and its foundation and where it is today, kind of paint them all as, flawed and individuals in positions of power who oppressed a lower class.
That just happened to build one of the greatest nations on earth, accidentally.
And so, what I'm getting at is there is this attitude that that you can just look back in history at an individual and just say, based on what I know now and how I see the world, they're bad, without really diving into more about the person. So I think it's a valuable exercise to look at people in the context of their time and what they stood for and what they were about. In this book, this podcast, I'm going to go over Theodore's upbringing and his personality and what he was most passionate about as a young boy, give you insights into the things he wrote and the things he did as a young man and the struggles that he went through, along with the privileges that he had, and kind of sort of give you a basic understanding of this man, Theodore Roosevelt. And in past podcasts, if you haven't watched those, do that, because we talk about Theodore Roosevelt at Harvard being a boxing champion, despite the fact that he had horrible asthma. We talked about this strenuous life and how he turned to nature in times of hardship. We talk about how Roosevelt became president upon McKinley's assassination, because he was the VP at the time. And we've talked about the teddy bear and how that came to be. So I think it's important to analyze this person in history, the time that he lived and what he accomplished, because he brought forward in this nation an awakening, a awareness of wildlife and nature and conservation that before his time wasn't implanted in the American psyche, and most of all was not institutionalized in our laws and our lands. And so now at this point, kind of go into him as a young man and give you a slice of Theodore Roosevelt as a boy. So I'm going to dive right in. Before I do that, I want to remind you, if you love the show, if you like what we do, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and leave us a comment on videos when you can, because that helps us on YouTube. Gets our show out there.
And we check the comments pretty frequently. We do try to respond to those.
Especially on YouTube, we really try to engage there. We're always open on social as well if you DM me or send me a message, but sometimes that gets bombarded, and it's hard on Instagram compared to YouTube. Because on YouTube, everything is collected. I can look through comments I've responded to, ones that I haven't. I can see everything.
Sort through them, and yeah.
On DMs, it's like they come in and they get lost, and I'm like, and when you move them from one section to the other, they go in order and they get lost. I got hundreds that come in, and so Instagram's a cumbersome tool to respond on unless I happen to be active on it that day. So, but anyway, do that, and then use the code GRITTY at Mountain Ops. Use the code GRITTY at Sissy Sticks. Get yourself some trekking poles. Season is coming up. They're half carbon fiber, half aluminum. They're solid. And at this point, I don't know why anyone would go backpacking, hunting without a pair of poles. They're essential.
Not only that, but he's priced them so well.
He has. A similar pole at REI is going to cost you over $200 for a similar design. So these are such a good product at the value they are, and you save when you use the code GRITTY. Also, seek outside. Use the code GRITTY there, and you get 5% off. Season is approaching. Get yourself a Cuban fiber shelter. Get yourself a Silex out of sil nylon. That's like $200 with a stove set up. It's pretty legit. Use your sissy stick poles with your Silex shelter because it's based on that. You have a super hyper lightweight system. And then archery season is approaching. So if you use the code GRITTY at Valkyrie Archery, you can get yourself a broadhead arrow system. I use Black Eagle X Impact micro diameter shafts. Very small shaft, very small fletchings. Doesn't blow in the wind. It's a lightweight shaft, but all my weight is up front. And I love that setup. I've been shooting it now 3 years. It's basically giving me a pass through on every single animal I've shot virtually. It's an incredible system. So check those guys out, and you save 5% there as well. And Alpaca rafts, they have a lead time. They're if you want a raft before the season starts, you need to order it now. Use the code GRITTY and you save 10% off at Alpaca Rafts, which is, over $100 savings. So if you do want a raft and you want it before the season starts, get in there and put in your order. Use the code GRITTY at Goat Knives. You need a skinning knife. We've got the season is approaching. Our buddy Travis Nowotny has come up with this. He's got new ones that are orange, which Lampers loves because he likes anything dipped in orange that you can easily spot. Use the code GRITTY at Graxaw. Get a discount on some 6-ounce game bags that'll do both elk and deer deboned. These bags are legit. You see them in the films that we're producing. Get a set of those. Use the code GRITTY and you'll save there. And also sheep feet. We have a lot of backpacking that we've been doing. I've been testing out the sheep feet. Ryan's been using them for 6 months or more, but all throughout the spring. Sheep feet, it creates custom orthotics for your boots. And these things, they custom fit to your feet. You get impressions made of your feet. And then, of course, they create these custom orthotics. Finally, our buddy Mark Livesey. If you have not purchased his Treeline Pursuits Academy, his e-scouting academy class, which there's a link for in this description field of this video, you're missing out. This is worth every penny. Use the code GRITTY and you get a big discount on the purchase. It's an e-course, which is going to teach you, it's going to teach you a ton about Google Earth, an app called Gaia. It's going to teach you about Onyx Maps. It's going to show you how to weave all these things together and then what kind of things you're looking for to find elk primarily on this course. It's amazing. It really is. It will change. If you take this course, it will forever change your hunting. Thanks for indulging us on that. It really helps us keep this show going and allows us to keep bringing you content as you guys support us when you get those products that you need, and it helps everyone out. It's a win-win, and we really appreciate that. So I'm going to get into this. All right. So I'm just going to read some from the book, and I'm going to talk about it as we go. Start from the book, and this book is written by Douglas Brinkley, New York Times bestseller, called The Wilderness Warrior. I've referenced it before. Theodore Roosevelt and the Crusade for America. This is actually chapter 1. It says, at a very early age, Theodore Roosevelt started studying the anatomy of more than 600 species of birds in North America. You might say that his natural affinity for ornithology was part of his metabolism. As a child, Roosevelt became a skilled field birder, acquiring a fine taxidermy collection while recording first-hand observations in notebooks now housed at Harvard University. Did you hear that, Brent? As a child, he became a skilled field birder, acquiring a fine taxidermy collection. Now, this isn't as a teenager.
This is a kid. If I knew a kid who had a taxidermy collection, I would tell people to keep an eye out for him as he gets older.
And it goes on to say, and it wasn't just birds. When Roosevelt was 4 or 5 years old, he saw a fox in a book and declared it the face of God. 4 or 5 years old. This wasn't merely a flight of fancy. The mere sight of a jackrabbit, flying squirrel, or box turtle caused Roosevelt to light up with glee. The multi-layered puzzle that was Roosevelt, in fact, was titillated by the very sound of species names in both English and Latin. Wolverines, gulo gulo.
Gulo gulo.
The red-bellied salamanders, Tarica rivularis. Snapping mackerel, Pomatemus saltatrix, and so on. Okay. Anyone who takes the time to learn the Latin names is a true nerd.
It's next level.
It's a true nerd. And you're going to see as you go through this and we talk more about this, you can't help but feel like, okay, he had really bad asthma, like debilitating levels of asthma. He's nearsighted to a point where he's practically blind. And he doesn't get his first pair of glasses until he's 12. So he goes through most of his life blind. Just blind, completely nearsighted, and sickly and weak, but totally fascinated by animals. I would say you could sort of put him in the category of misfit nerd.
Easily.
A little bit.
Mm-hmm. I don't think he had a plethora of friends. I'm going to throw that out there. I don't know this.
Perhaps.
This is circumstantial. This is just what I'm taking.
Although at Harvard, he becomes one of the most popular kids in school.
Well, because he got in a ring and beat the crap out of people.
Here's the thing.
That helps a
Here's
lot.
the thing I want to emphasize, and will be a recurring theme if you study or spend any time looking into Theodore Roosevelt's life. The man was not gifted with a lot of physical privilege. You know, he was sickly, he was weak, nearsighted, yet he never plays the victim in any way. He always adapts and overcomes. Remember, his father comes to him at one point in his life and he says, all right, son, God didn't really bless you with any physical ability or health. The only way that you're going to get through this life is if you make yourself strong. And it's all on you. You're going to have to go through the pain of it. And he decides, okay. And what's he do? He starts doing push-ups and sit-ups and walks and hikes. And basically he transforms himself from a weakling, pathetic, sickly human, born that way mostly from birth, into the man considered strong as an ox, unstoppable, will not quit. The Rough Riders, fights in Cuba, does the Western frontier. He's the guy that gets shot, when he gets up to give his speech in an assassination attempt. And then while shot, still does a speech.
Finishes.
Yeah.
It wasn't like it was a quick finish. It was 45 minutes later he finishes.
Absolutely. It's pretty amazing. So that's going to be a recurring theme. Roosevelt adapts and overcomes. And that's what is fascinating to me about him. He is the epitome of gritty, of grit, of finding a way to get through it. Okay, back to his early life. Roosevelt began his life as a naturalist, and he ended his life as a naturalist, wrote the historian Paul Russell Cutright. Throughout a half-century of strenuous activity, his interest in wildlife, though subject to ebb and flow, was never abandoned at any time. And it's fascinating because remember how he becomes president right after McKinley is assassinated, and one of the first things he does is go off on a cougar hunt.
I can't handle you guys right now.
Right. Or I think that was when he became vice president. But either way, the point is, he will always be fascinated by nature throughout his entire life. And even though he goes and he serves in political offices for abolitionist purposes, for the rights of people, but he's constantly fascinated by animals and the natural world in spite of it. He's always reading, he's finding some time to fit in some book on some, obscure animal in Darwinism, in science. It never ends. That's always a love. And you'll see that. So it says, Roosevelt was born in October 27, 1858 in the noisy hubbub of gaslit New York City. He struggled with ill health well into adulthood. I was, Roosevelt later wrote, a wretched mite suffering acutely with asthma. Often wheezing, the young Roosevelt found physical relief by simply observing creatures, habits, and breathing fresh air. Nature served as a curative agent for Roosevelt, as it's been known to do for millions afflicted with respiratory illness. There are no words that can tell the hidden spirit of the wilderness, he wrote, that can reveal its mystery, its melancholy, and its charm. Literally from childhood until his death in January 1919, following his arduous journey down the River of Doubt through Brazil's uncharted Amazon jungle, he epitomized Ralph Waldo Emerson's criterion for being an incurable naturalist. The lover of nature is he whose inward and outward senses are still truly adjusted to each other, Emerson explained, who has retained the spirit of infancy even into the era of manhood. Just over a year after Roosevelt's birth, the British naturalist Charles Darwin published his great scientific treatise on the origin of species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Deeply personal in tone, without esoteric graphs or undecipherable tables, On the Origin of Species set off heated global debate over religious beliefs that underlay the then current theories of biology. Darwin's great idea was evolution by natural selection. By the time Theodore was 10 or 11, the biologist was his touchstone, a Noah-like hero. He was enthralled by the idea of collecting species in faraway places, and in his youthful imagination, the Garden of Eden was replaced by Darwin's Galapagos Islands. Almost 20 years before, Darwin had written about circumnavigating the world, collecting specimens of animals and plants, both alive and dead, in The Voyage of the Beagle.
The Voyage of the Beagle?
Yeah, it was the name of the ship, as far as I know. So, picture this. The early 1800s, you have this naturalist, Charles Darwin, legend, right? Going out and collecting animals, thinking about the world, discovering this idea of the theory of evolution, discovering this theory of the survival of the fittest, which in many ways epitomizes the ethos that Theodore Roosevelt lives by. He's fascinated by nature. He's a weak and pathetic person, and he determines that it's the survival of the fittest. If I make myself stronger, if I take what I have been endowed with and I try to maximize it to its greatest possibility, then where will it take me? That was the journey he was under. That was the cross he decided to bear. He didn't say, well, I'm just screwed. It's just the way it is. I'm just unhealthy. I got a raw deal. He didn't do that. Theodore Roosevelt said, nope, survival of the fittest. I'm going to take my cross. I'm going to bear it. And I'm going to take personal responsibility for my life. I'm going to, through blood, sweat, and tears, I am going to craft it into what I want my life to be. Each time he is faced with heartache, sorrow, or obstacles, the man finds a way to get around it, much to the annoyance of his detractors who wanted to destroy him. Back to the book, he says, so he's fascinated by this person, Charles Darwin. Then Charles Darwin comes out with his quintessential masterpiece, The Origin of Species, and you learn about the means of natural selection, and the world is flipped on its head. And Theodore Roosevelt is, at this time, taking in all this nature, and he's naturally fascinated with it. And he sees this, and he becomes a lover of science and the idea of the theory of evolution and what that means. Once Roosevelt grasped the concept of natural selection, his bird-watching instincts went into overdrive. Suddenly, he understood that the biological world wasn't static. Observed similarities between living creatures were often a product of shared evolutionary history. With Darwinian eyes, he now studied every beak and eye stripe, hoping to reconcile anomalies in the natural world. As an adult, he would often carry On the Origin of Species, the book, with him in his saddlebag or cartridge case while on hunts. There was nothing unusual about a 19th century child being enamored of animals and wildlife. Whether it's Aesop's fables or Mother Goose, the most enduring children's literature often featured lovable, talking animals. But the young Roosevelt was different from most other children. From an early age, he liked to learn about wildlife scientifically by firsthand observation. The cuteness of anthropomorphized animals in the popular press annoyed Theodore. Darwinian wildlife biology, on the other hand, captured his imagination, and had the effect of smelling salts. Basically, you'll see throughout his life that he really couldn't stand fake nature. Nature where they attributed human traits to animals. Like he truly did look at the world for what it really was, and he wanted to understand it for what it really was. In fact, we get into later, he talks about the books that he enjoyed outside of the scientific realm, outside of taxonomy and understanding the, birds and so forth. And when you follow, he liked these adventure books, kind of like your Huckleberry Finn type romps, right? Only these were hunters. And there's a book called The Boy Hunters. The Boy Hunters.
That's a terrible name.
It's terrible. And what it is there's this retired colonel or something and
Still sounds
in this military, bad. And he comes out west and he's supposed to procure a white buffalo. And it's this legendary animal that supposedly is out there somewhere that the natives revere as a holy animal. And they're there to try to find one. And he's been asked by this king or someone to the colonel to bring back this treasure, but he's too weak and old to do it. So he sends his 3 boys who are really young. Like, you can imagine as a young boy reading this tale and you're like, oh yeah, right on. And the boys, we'll get into it, but the boys, go on all these adventures, and he is all about these stories.
The boy hunters.
Yeah. What you'll also find as a recurring theme in each of these books and stories, generally, often they lean on the side of racist.
Yeah.
Both natives and black slaves and so on. There's a culture there, and which is interesting because Theodore Roosevelt's father is an avid abolitionist and fights for the freedom of the emancipation of the slaves. And he is deeply concerned about the plight and the future of the freed slave. And at the same time, his father cares deeply about animals. And he's basically an animal rights activist as well.
It's very ahead of his time.
But Theodore Roosevelt's mother is this Southern belle from Georgia who grew up in a slave-owning family and has stories, of the South. And so it's like, okay, where does Theodore Roosevelt fall in the midst of all this that's going on? Remember, he's born in 1858, right about Civil War time and post-Civil War time. You'll see later, as we talked about in an earlier podcast, that Theodore Roosevelt judged people by their character. Theodore Roosevelt invited Booker T. Washington, the first black man to dine for dinner at the White House, to his table. And he paid for it for years and years and years, where he was attacked by the public for having, of course, by racist people, attacked for having Booker T. Washington at the White House. And he even hesitated when he thought nothing of it in terms of, let's invite him to the White House and let's have dinner and let's get together. He didn't see his skin color. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, he knew the social pressures and the backlash that he would face, especially from the South, for accepting him. And the fact that he doubted himself really disgusted himself. Mm-hmm. And before he could change his mind or think about the consequences of that, he stole his resolve to do what he felt in his heart was right, which was to treat Booker T. Washington as an equal and ignore the color of his skin. And so
what I find very funny about that story is Theodore has an instant of feeling of, oh, maybe I shouldn't do this, immediately jumps on it so that he makes sure that it happens because he obviously thinks it's the right thing to do. But on the other hand, you have Booker who gets the letter and thinks the exact same thing.
Yeah.
Just for a second, then he's like, crap, now I have to do this.
Which is fascinating, right? Because as a black man, he has to decide whether to go to dinner or not at the White House. And he actually doesn't want to. This will bring so much hatred upon me if I do this thing. I don't want this. Mm-hmm. But then he, just like Roosevelt, as a principled man, decided, I have a duty. I have a duty to do this because I can't let my skin color dictate me either in what I do. Like, I need to stand up for this principle as well, that it's not about race, it's about my character. And so then he goes to the White House. And so they both knew they were screwed. They both knew it.
It must have been a great dinner.
And they both really faced a lot of dark times as a result of it, but they also accomplished incredible good at the same. That's something I think we should remember right now with the goings on that are happening. It's not easy to do the right thing. And that often when you do the right thing, it's like you're punished for it. But history looks back on that event, and you can't help but admire both the men for the choices they made. That's why I get so angry when people say they want to tear down a statue of Theodore Roosevelt, talking about things that he did that were wrong or that were mistakes or that they see as injustices. It's like you have to look at a human being and history holistically, not just pick the part you don't like and then highlight it and ignore all the rest. I find that practice so disgusting because it's not about what's right. It's about your narrative. It's about the story you're trying to tell. And it's not right. It's not fair. It's not honest. A man isn't just one action. He's a sum of all the things that he accomplished. And I think it's so arrogant for people today to look at people in history and judge them. Judge them when they themselves have accomplished nothing on the magnitude of they're standing on the shoulders of giants and casting hate and ridicule on them. It's disgusting. It's a joke. People that they should aspire to do a tenth of, instead they ridicule as their lesser. Anyway, that was a tangent. Back to the book. This devotion to Darwin, a real sense of awe, continued long after Roosevelt was an adult. Even when he was president, grappling with showcasing the Great White Fleet and building the Panama Canal, which he did, stories abounded about Roosevelt hurrying across the White House lawn exclaiming, "Very early for a fox sparrow," and then suddenly stopping to pick up a feather for closer coloration inspection. Believing that evolution was factual, President Roosevelt nevertheless conceded that the concept of natural selection needed to undergo constant scientific experimentation, and the more data, the better. But before Roosevelt discovered Darwin, there were the picture books and outdoor narratives aimed at the boys' market. Every parent recognizes the moment when a child displays a special aptitude or precocity for learning, when hopes arise that it's a harbinger of great educational accomplishment to come. Such sudden bursts of enthusiasm from a toddler indicate both personality and preference. When Theodore Roosevelt obsessed over the lavish illustrations in David Livingstone's missionary travels and researches in South Africa and asked questions about Darwin's theory of evolution, his parents, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. and Martha Bullock Roosevelt, realized their son was an aspiring naturalist. And it goes on to describe books that he really liked. You know, as I read about Roosevelt, I can't help but reflect on my own childhood and my own background. I remember Ryan and I read the book. It's a podcast. We did it years ago on Daniel Boone, a biography, I think is what it was called. If you just Google Gritty and Daniel Boone, you'll probably find it. And Ryan Lampers and I read the book together for fun and then did a little talk about it. And Ryan read the book and felt at one with Daniel Boone. Like there was a kinship there where he related to Daniel Boone on a deep level. Boone was a Quaker by birth and by upbringing, but he kind of goes against the pacifist ways of the Quaker and so on, and he spends a lot of time in the wilderness, and he becomes close to the Indians, and he likes being alone a lot in the wilderness. He'd rather be alone in the wilderness than around people. You know, hanging out with Lampers and hearing about his high school and childhood and stuff. He and I are really different, you know, but I can see how he related a lot to this person, Daniel Boone. When I read Theodore Roosevelt, I relate a lot to the person that he is, and I feel this connection there because when I was a kid, you'll read later like he's fascinated with animals, dead or alive. If there's an animal part, he can't help but like play with it, touch it. In this book, you know, I'll tell you, he comes across this seal this afternoon. He finds this dead seal at a fish stand among the piles of maritime products available for sale on the wharf: scallops, tuna, and other food fish. Dried seahorses and pipefishes hawked for their medicinal qualities and much more. Roosevelt fixated on the dead seal's bulk and whiskers, The fact that the species had been netted in New York Harbor, where it was a rare visitor, flabbergasted him. Day after day, as if drawn to a talisman, he kept begging to be brought to the pier to study the seal's anatomy more closely. As a budding naturalist acquainted with the voyage of the Beagle, which is Darwin's boat, the 7 or 8-year-old noted that seals had no external ears and that their back flippers didn't bend forward to help their bodies when they were on dry land. Zoology books taught him that there were 19 seal species in the world, most living around Antarctica and the Arctic Circle. That seal filled me with every possible feeling of romance and adventure, he later recalled in his autobiography. I had already begun to read some of Mayne Reid's books and other boys' books of adventure, and I felt that this seal brought all these adventures in realistic fashion before me. As long as the seal remained there, I haunted the neighborhood of the market day after day. I measured it, and I recall that, not having a tape measure, I had to do my best to get its girth with a folding pocket foot rule. A difficult undertaking. I carefully made a record of the utterly useless measurements and at once began to write a natural history of my own and the strength of that seal. Eventually, once the seal's body was sold for blubber, Roosevelt was given the head as a souvenir. With this in hand, the 10-year-old created his, quote, Roosevelt Museum of Natural History. Its purpose was to help train him to become a natural history professional like Darwin. Bookshelf space was made in the upstairs hall at 28 East 20th Street for tag number 1, and before long he had rows of bird nests, dead insects, and mouse skeletons. He considered himself a general collector with a particular interest in salamanders and squirrels. After a few months, however, he turned his focus primarily to birds. Before long, he had numerous specimens to call his own. There is, in fact, a precious historical document housed at Harvard University, handwritten and 5 pages long, that illuminates the sheer earnestness with which young Theodore maintained his natural history collection, titled Record of the Roosevelt Museum. It begins with a proclamation of professional accomplishment. Quote, at the commencement of the year 1867, Mr. T. Roosevelt, Jr. started the museum with 12 specimens. At the close of the same year, Mr. J.W. Roosevelt, West Roosevelt was his cousin, joined him, but each kept his own specimens, these amounting to hardly 100. During 1868, they accumulated 150 specimens, making a total of 250 specimens. Roosevelt scrambled for new specimens of mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and insects wherever he could. Conch shells, larvae, hollowed eggs, and even a common cockroach were worth inclusion into his growing windowsill and bookshelf collection. In an article titled My Life as a Naturalist, written in 1918, when he was an ex-president, Roosevelt recalled that he collected specimens the way other boys collected stamps. Jars of tadpoles and minnows were particular favorites in his museum. Heading up 3rd Avenue toward the Harlem River, Roosevelt would wander the fields looking for rabbit holes and woodcock feathers. Leaves found in Gramercy Park were pressed into books and preserved. Young Theodore prided himself on being able to distinguish a hardwood from a conifer. Sometimes he would study the difference between leaves from the same tree like a perplexed botanist. The dude was into animals, and this is the dead animals he's collecting. He has this obsession with live animals as well, where he wants to have everything he can find as a pet. And he does. I mean, there's a whole list of things which we might get into later where he just talks about all the animals he has, you know. And so back to what I was saying earlier, when I was a kid, you know, you weren't born yet because you weren't born till I was about 16. When I was 17, 18, you were 1 year old, 2 year old, you know, so I don't know how much you remember, but as a young man, I was obsessed with wildlife and I would beg Mom for pets. And our mother does not like pets.
Doesn't like animals.
She likes looking at them. She doesn't.
For behind class.
She doesn't want the dirtiness. You know, she's very, I would say, obsessive compulsive, likes her things clean, mildly.
There's clean and then there's mother's clean.
And so she and I are quite different in that regard because I'm all about the dirt and the animals and and the smells and it doesn't like, I'm fascinated by it. And I was fascinated by animals and watching them and catching them. As a kid, I remember catching a duck, a nesting duck. We tried like for days trying to catch this duck. And finally we sneaked this, we had this idea. I don't know, I was first grade or something. And we took this rabbit cage and we fashioned it and we stuck the duck's nest inside the cage so that if it wanted to sit on the nest, it had to go inside the cage. And so and it was on the shore of this pond that we would walk by on our way home from school every day. And when we discovered the nest, I was blown away, and we tried to catch the duck, but it would get away. We sat there on this pond and we snuck up to the edge, and the duck didn't want to leave her nest, so I did this whole stealth thing where I got close and I had this little stick that would close the door and trap the duck inside. And so, from a distance of like 8 feet, the duck saw me and was kind of looking at me, and I fling the door shut and caught this duck. And then I was like, okay, now we're going to have it hatch its eggs and we're going to keep the ducklings and, all these ideas that young people have that they have no idea. They just signed a death warrant for these ducks. Mom and Dad found out that we trapped a duck because we were like, we don't know how to keep it alive or feed it. And they're like, this ain't going to work, boys. And the same thing happened. I caught a squirrel once, a baby squirrel. I caught a few throughout my life when we were young, and we tried to raise them. One of them we were quite successful with, and it was at the Morris's house, Cousin Ben's house. And it would hang out in like Sophie's pocket, and it would run around and climb the curtains. And it was like the friendliest, coolest little critter around. Probably had diseases for all we know, but it did bite a couple of us. But the little thing was quite tame, fascinating animal to have around. And anytime we could, catch frogs, tadpoles, all that stuff, I was absolutely obsessed with with animals. I would read books and encyclopedias on animals too. And I'd always want to learn about animals. Even today, I get stuck in the YouTube universe of animals extinct and today. And it's always been a fascination for me. And I like books and I like reading. And so I feel this connection in this way. As I got older and my mom couldn't tell me I couldn't have a pet, that's when things got real wild because I have had so many pets. But then when I got married, my poor wife.
All hell broke loose.
I've had iguanas, bearded dragons,
sugar gliders, birds.
I love birds. I love birds. I had a blue and gold macaw, which is way too much bird for me. But I couldn't help it. I was fascinated. I'm the guy that would from a young boy to even now, I'll just go to some kind of zoo or pet store and I'll just look at every single animal in there, and I never get tired of it. And I remember, I had the blue and gold macaw. I had African Senegal. I had a Pyonis. I had a Pyonis. I trained all these birds, and they were all quite behaved. As I learned about different animals, I also got into aquariums and fish tanks. And people don't know this, but Bryce and I, my brother-in-law and I, we had full-on 250-gallon ocean reef tanks in the house with exotic, like fish from all over the world and coral. We would propagate coral and we would sell them. And we were quite good at this ocean coral. And it was like you had to have a degree in both biology and chemistry as you were dealing with the nitrogen cycle and bacteria and rock that you were curing from Fiji and the different pests and parasites that would get on corals and harm them, and the different balance of ecosystem you were trying to put in with different fish that would, where you were trying to create this ecosystem of the ocean right in your house. And it was spectacular. The corals that we had, I think at one point our reef tank was worth like $22,000 or something in individual parts and corals. And it's so funny because all of this was part of my life as I was growing up and going through college and all these. I was always distracted by some kind of pet or animal that I wanted to have around me. And at the same time, always loved hunting as well at the same time. But just being fascinated by the natural world. And that fascination has never left me. And the other way that I really resonate or connect, I feel like, with Roosevelt is this idea of public lands and what they mean and why they're important. And also this idea of personal accountability, responsibility, and overcoming trials, that when you go out in nature, that it can heal, the healing outdoors, as we've talked about. So I hope this is kind of helping you get a picture for Roosevelt, his personality. Maybe you're connecting to him too. Maybe you're like me and you've been fascinated by animals or maybe science. Back to the book, it says, "My triumphs," Roosevelt recalled, "of his childhood consisted in such things as bringing home and raising by the aid of milk and syringe a family of very young squirrels, in fruitlessly endeavoring to tame an excessively unamiable woodchuck, and in making friends with a gentle, pretty, trustful, white-footed mouse which reared her family in an empty flower pot." So he and I, we had our pets. We had our wild animals we tried to make our friends. In the spring of 1868, this is when he is basically, 10 years old, Theodore's parents traveled to Roswell to visit Martha's relatives, his mother. A fascinating correspondence between mother and son has survived, illuminating young Theodore's love of collecting all things wild. He says, "I have just received your letter," he wrote to his mother on April 28th. "My mouth opened wide in astonishment when I heard how many flowers were sent to you. I could revel in the buggy ones. I jumped with delight when I found you had heard a mockingbird. Get some of the feathers if you can. I am sorry the trees have been cut down. In the letters you write, do tell me how many curiosities and living things you have got for me. I wish I were with you, for I could hunt for myself." He's dying inside because his mom's in some other part of the world collecting animals and parts and bushes on his behalf. He said 2 days later, the precocious 9-year-old responded to a letter from his father, angling for some hard-to-find plants. He says, "I have a request to make of you. Will you do it? I hope you will. If you will, it will figure greatly in my museum. You know what supple jacks are, don't you? Please get 2 for Elliot, his younger brother, and 1 for me. Ask your friend to let you cut off the tiger cat's tail and get some long moose and have it mated together. One of the supple jacks, I am talking of mine now, must be about as thick as your finger, and thumb must be 4 feet long, and the other must be 3 feet long. One of my mice got crushed. It was the mouse I liked best, though it was a common mouse. Its name was Brownie." As a young boy, Roosevelt not only collected live mice and a woodchuck, but also sketched them in notepads, a few of which have survived undamaged, and they're pretty dang good drawings.
Are they?
Yeah, they're actually, here's one right here. Not bad.
Oh, wow. That's really good.
Continuing on this theme, he does read James Fenimore Cooper, Last of the Mohicans, and all his other writings. He reads, they're the Leather Stocking Tales, I think is what it's called. I've read them too. It's been a long time, but they're a little wordy. Their prose are a little extravagant. But if you've seen the movie Last of the Mohicans, there's some similarities. Story's different though in the classic, and it's considered a classic, although some people think it's a hack job of writing. But there's other books too that I told you he read, but he liked those adventure, cowboy, Native American, how the West is won kind of stories. But he particularly liked the ones that included like the taxonomy and real nature, where it actually was realistic. What he could not stand were books like one he describes, which is Swiss Family Robinson. He couldn't stand Swiss Family Robinson. I'm going to read a little bit here. He did like this Captain Reed, which I said had the Boy Hunters was the book written by this man, Captain Reed, which it says in here that Edgar Allan Poe witheringly described as a colossal but most picturesque liar. So Edgar Allan Poe didn't care for Theodore's childhood boy book. But often you read things as a young man that you see as junk as an adult. But the point of books targeted at a youth market is at. And if you can strike the imagination of a young person, it might seem trivial to an adult, but it might really resonate with a youth. But He says other outdoors books for boys didn't much appeal to Roosevelt. For example, he dismissed John D. Weiss's The Swiss Family Robinson for its clumsy zoology and was bored by its tropical escapism and dragfoot juvenility. According to young Teddy Roosevelt, Weiss had assembled a wholly impossible collection of animals to pad his plot about survival after a shipwreck. I think Disney killed it, though. It is one of the best Disney films of all time. My kids and I watch it all the time. Great flick. But yeah, where does an ostrich come from on a tropical island? Where does an elephant? A tiger? Like, he's right. It's completely fake. None of these animals are indigenous to this region, and so I can see why Theodore despised the book. But as a young kid, when I watched Swiss Family Robinson, no clue.
No problems.
No idea. I was like, yeah, of course there's crocodiles and giant anacondas and, all these different animals. Hyenas and stuff running around. Of course. And of course you can ride them in a race, Of
course.
So anyway, it was quite the, it's so funny. According to Theodore Roosevelt as a young man, he wrote that Weiss had assembled a wholly impossible collection of animals. And that's true. Like, as I got older and I was watching Swiss Family Robinson, I'm like, this is completely ludicrous.
Pirates, bro. Pirates. Pirates came, they dropped stuff off.
Yeah, the pirate thing was believable. Mm-hmm. More or less, right? So one thing that the book talks about is Theodore was ready to discuss bears at any time, day or night. And we talked about, it's so fitting that there's the teddy bear, that he hunted with Collier, that he is fascinated by bears, and he is throughout his whole life. And so on that note, too, I am drawn to Roosevelt. I'm going to read what the book says about this. It says, throughout his life, bears mesmerized Roosevelt. In an autobiography, in fact, he wrote wide-eyed of Bear Bob, a former slave once owned by his mother's family in Georgia, who had been scalped by an angry black bear's claw. That violent, degrading spectacle haunted Roosevelt's imagination. Even at 9, Roosevelt saw bears, lumbering giants that can run as fast as a racehorse for short distances, as a symbol of wilderness. Enamored of their cunning curiosity and ferocity when provoked, Roosevelt marveled that their acute sense of smell enabled them to detect game from nearly 1 mile away. He also noted that bears belonged to a mammal group referred to as plantigrade, i.e. flat-footed, in contrast to digitrade animals, which walk on their toes like cats and dogs. Young Roosevelt rejected the human-like Thomas Nast cartoons of these omnivores in Harper's Weekly, popular in the 1860s, in favor of cutting-edge zoology books with the exact details on non-retractable claws' agility, among black bears only in climbing trees. With scientific detachment, young Theodore would correct people who casually claimed that all bears hibernate in winter. They don't, and such sloppy misconceptions annoyed him greatly.
He sounds like a kid who reads the instruction manual for fun.
He's funny. Like, I remember when I was learning that bears didn't hibernate. Like, took some of these things for granted, but they don't always hibernate. And as I learned more about bear behavior, remember we took that bear on Prince of Wales Island years ago. We've never published any video around this, but it's the biggest bear I've ever taken on the island, and it's a massive bear, and he had tags in his ears, one in each ear. He was kind of a problem bear with the local area. I don't know how old he was. Old, maybe 17 years old or something like that. 15 years old. The biggest black bear I've ever seen. Looked like a grizzly, just like a giant gorilla, like something different. When we spoke to Ketchikan, the fish and game folks, they came out and they had to actually mess around with the bear, because you have to check in the bear in Alaska anyway, and you do in a lot of states. And they pull a tooth and they judge the age of the bear and all that kind of stuff. They document some things about the bear and they track it. Well, this bear had tags in its ears, and so it was a specimen they'd been following for a long time and tracking its movement and behavior. It's totally legal to shoot that bear. We in fact checked the regulations, like, can you shoot bears that have tags in there? Well, what do the tags mean?
Because you actually caught pictures of him on a couple game cams that we popped up.
Yeah, but that's how we knew he was there, and then we started to target him because he was a beast. We basically hung like 7 cameras on logging roads and then just went off and fished and hunted other areas and then came back and checked the camera, and we're like, oh, this bear like walks down this road every other day around this time. And so we started to try to hunt him and finally got him on the last day, on the last hour. Mm-hmm. But when we spoke to the game officer, Fish and Game, they're like, yeah, this bear didn't hibernate. Like, this bear hasn't hibernated for probably more than 2 years. And he was massive. He didn't look like he'd just come out of hibernation. He's spring
And he
bear.
wasn't like super crazy fat either. He was just
muscle. I mean, he had some fat, but he was just, he was muscle. And they said, well, we've had really 2 mild winters. And when winters are that mild and there's so much food around, it doesn't trigger this hormone response to really, and when they're this big and powerful and strong, some bears just stop hibernating unless they really need to. And so they're like, this bear just ate throughout the whole winter. The reason he's so massive and so big and so strong is because he just says, nah, not going to hibernate. Just going to do my thing. That was kind of an eye opener for me. And they were like, oh no, this bear didn't hibernate. No way. No way. He had a perfect coat too, which a lot of times in POW, they have rubbed spots. Now, people think those rubbed spots come from them rubbing on a tree because they have, some kind of itch or ticks or whatever, or the heat. They want to rub that fur off. And there is a lot of truth to that. But what's more common is it's in the hibernation, especially on these wet islands. There's a lot of moisture no matter where they hibernate. Mm-hmm. And when they lay there and they sleep and there's all that moisture and some heat from their body and there's different bugs and mites and other things, it causes hair loss in the den. So when they come out of the den, there's a lot of bears that hair loss is due to sleeping in the den. Back to the book, it says, for example, he believed bears were wicked smart, able to backtrack in their own footprints to shake hunting dogs off their easily detectable scent. Yet popular culture usually portrayed bears as slothful, honey-loving buffoons hiding in dens. Often black bears were written about as small cousins of grizzlies. To a degree, that assessment was fair. But it bothered Roosevelt, who knew that there was nothing small about black bears. Hunters had recently killed adult black bear males weighing well over 300 pounds, with short, stubby claws used to scale trees quickly. In Native American lore, so-called spirit bears, black, brown, grizzly, and polar, were all endowed with sacred characteristics. But in European culture, they often had a menacing reputation, as in Goldilocks and the Three Bears. As a boy, Roosevelt was largely unimpressed with both caricatures of bears. He wanted hard, factual, empirical data about their instinctive habits. My own experience with bears, he later wrote, tends to make me lay special emphasis upon their variation of temper, which is something that I've said a lot of times. Bears are as unique as people. Mm-hmm. And I think often when you get into higher levels of intelligence, you have greater diversity of personality. A cow is a cow. Chicken is a chicken. Mm-hmm. They have some personality traits, but in general, they're kind of monotonous. Mm-hmm. When you deal with bears or mountain lions, for example, they have been known to have food preferences, animals that they hunt. Some mountain lions only really hunt porcupines, and some are specialized at hunting deer, some elk. Like, they kind of tend to have personalities and specialize in certain things. And the same is true for bears. Some bears are afraid of people and they just run at the sight of them every single time. And some bears would like to eat people and will if they get the chance. And so often I have people say to me, well, why are you worried about bears, man? They're going to run away. Just spray some stuff at them. And it's like, I understand that. But all it takes is the wrong bear on the wrong day with a different personality. One that's belligerent and pissed off and in a bad mood or hungry, protective. It just takes that and the temperament of the bears, like Theodore says, that there is such a variation of tempers that I feel that you have to be careful with bears. You can't assume because all the bears you've run into have been afraid of people that you're not going to find one that's like not. talking about Theodore's father, it says, as Theodore's diaries attest, which he kept a number of diaries that we have, where he kept a religious diary for, daily for months or even some years. And some of these are from when he was at this age. And so you have his full-on diary and everything he logged.
That's cool.
And it says in the book, as these diaries attest, the future president's father encouraged TR's love of nature. Straight-laced, slightly pious, and a dutiful husband, Theodore Roosevelt Sr. preferred philanthropy over business and was always ready to aid the poor and the needy. Very interesting, how he preferred philanthropy over business and was always ready to aid the poor and the needy. I was doing that podcast about how the Marxism and about how the world is motivated by socioeconomic struggle, the people that have power and the people that don't, and that primarily everything is economically driven, and motives are kind of boiled down to that. That's kind of what the theory suggests, and that if we could just fix the socioeconomic issues of the world, it would fix everything else. When you really think about it, I mean, it's a attractive idea in some ways, because what it does is it encourages someone to be weak and then go down that road, because it's like, yeah, you're right. Like, I'm a victim. If the government can just fix some social injustices, then I would be happy. It presupposes that economics and socioeconomic conditions are the basis upon which people are happy. And what's interesting is I think that's absolutely ridiculous, because I'm not really motivated by money.
Which is really bad for the business.
Right. I want enough to have some freedom and to pursue the things I'm interested in. But I'm sadly demotivated beyond that. I'm not driven that way. And Lampers is just as bad. And so when you have two people that all we want to do is go to the mountains and hunt and eat mushrooms and bear, it's like, it's really hard. I want enough gear to do some of the things I want to do, but it's not, prior to having the connections I do now, I mean, I hunted in a Walmart tent and crappy shoes. I mean, I would have found a way within my means to do what I want to do. Ryan was the same way. He didn't run a Seek Outside shelter until the last few years. I think he ran his Hubba MSR tent for 20 something years. Mm-hmm. That thing sucks. There's no comfort in that at all.
Oh, he loves that thing.
Well, not now. I mean, but the man, you'd think he would have upgraded too. But once he found that hub, nope, it was good enough. But the point is, it's an interesting idea. His father, he was really more interested in aiding the poor and the needy and philanthropy than he was about business. And it goes on to say that he was an abolitionist before the Civil War. So he stood against slavery before the Civil War. And his father, now during the Reconstruction era, had emancipationist memory, as the historian David W. Blight called the belief that the federal government should intervene to help the poor and disenfranchised, and a determination to be part of the progressive movements of the day. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. worried that in this thirst for post-Civil War reconciliation, African Americans were going to be discriminated against. But the main thrust of his philanthropy was to extol natural history and animal protection, promoting the humane treatment of horses, making sure they weren't abused, became one of his civic concerns. In fact, in an autobiography, TR goes on for a couple of pages about his father's prowess with horse reins, bragging that he was a fine four-in-hand carriage driver. A man of medium height, Theodore Sr. was so well proportioned and carried himself with such perfect posture that he seemed much larger. He was a big, powerful man with a leonine face, and his heart filled with gentleness for those who needed help or protection. Roosevelt recalled, and with the possibility of much wrath against a bully or an oppressor. Yeah, he stood with much wrath against bullies or an oppressor. And there's some photos of his dad. His dad was a stud.
Yeah?
But he gave birth to a sickly weakling.
I blame the
it's
mother.
so funny. And so it's interesting. But his dad was a man of compassion. And I think we're going to end the podcast today. I want to get into later this humane animal treatment discussion next, because you hear some pretty bad stories. I mean, back in the day, and you have to think about it at that time, people were trying to survive. They were trying to just feed their families. And if it meant pushing a horse to the brink of death in order to, save your child, people abused animals. But there was that out of necessity, out of need or perceived need, where animals were worked to the bone. But there was also the detachment toward animals, the lack of compassion, where it was truly heinous, like where they would catch sea turtles on ships, and then they would just nail the turtle to the deck of the boat so it couldn't leave. And so the easiest way is to just nail their fins to the deck of the ship and then just let them starve to death, be out of the water, suffer alive. But it keeps them alive so that when they rolled into the shipyards in New York, they could just pull them all off the deck of the ship and sell them for a lot of money to the stores to make turtle soup, which was a delicacy in New York. The treatment of animals, like that was a horribly inhumane way, these turtle ships to operate. And the book goes into the cultural things going on at the time. And what his father was suggesting was actually quite revolutionary for the time. The humane treatment of animals was not so much a concern. And as you study history and you study people, one of the things that has come about over the years is that they say that caring about animals, the future of the planet and nature, in many ways is the luxury of a wealthy country.
I said that's a first world problem. No one else really thinks about that.
Because when you are just trying to survive in a crap hole in another part of the world, I won't name any to get into trouble.
Won't name any of those crap hole countries?
When you're dealing with that, they're so poverty stricken that they're just trying to live, not have their children die. They don't have time to worry about pollution. They don't, and for us from our ivory towers and our wealth to sit here and look down upon them and say, we need to save all the animals in South Africa. Like I feel some pity for those people who are caught poaching a rhino, and each situation is quite different. And you can vilify those people as horrible, wasteful. And it's like, yeah, while you sit here in America with your opulent wealth, not starving to death, not living in poverty and abject poverty and misery. I'll go back to what I said earlier. Money does not bring happiness. Money is not what brings people fulfillment and meaning. But you must have a base level of human needs met, or you can't even think about what is meaningful. So there is a basic level of needs, shelter, food, water, that has to be there. But once all that's met and your physical needs, so to speak, are fairly well handled and everything's going to be good and you're safe. Incremental levels of wealth beyond that level, people often think are going to bring them happiness. You see it today. A lot of I feel politicians prey on this idea that, hey, you're not as rich as this guy and that guy, therefore you should be unhappy. You only make $50,000, $30,000 a year, therefore you should be pissed off because this guy makes $200,000, this guy makes $1 million. You should be angry. The system is stacked against you. And it's like the idea that more money is going to make me happy is wrong. It's wrong. And I said this to myself years ago. If I am not happy in my current financial state, this is when I was in college and poor as dirt, because I was quite happy actually. And I was thinking, man, I don't need much. I got a crappy Volkswagen diesel dasher. That's my car. Paid for $700. Later I had a Volkswagen bus that was my dad's that I got to run again. I mean, I drove that car forever. Paid for.
That was an awesome hoop.
But it was a nice hoopty. But I realized that I was really happy being poor, living off given plasma, having enough to pay for my apartment and some ramen noodles, and going fishing, because Chad and I actually lived on the fish we caught in college. I mean, we would stack the freezer with fish, and it was actually not just for the adventure. It was for food. I was extremely happy with very little in terms of what the world would say is, economic wealth. I had a place to stay that was a rundown apartment that I shared with like 6 other guys who were filthy. And I had a junky car, and I had $25 a week for groceries. That was my thing. And I was dating a hot chick and going to school and fishing every chance I got. And I was happy. And I realized too later that to me, it's like a litmus test. If you can't be happy now, what makes you think more money is going to fix it? Because life is about more than material wealth, so much more. And so maybe the hole you're trying to fill can't be filled with more money. You got to sort your life out and your person out in spite of the money, in spite of the wealth. From that poverty perspective, like I said, there's a certain amount of poverty that, yes, when you're worried about dying, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. But in America, our poverty levels make you wealthier than most people in that level. Still have a cell phone and a car, and they're not going to starve to death. They're just not able to go to the fancy restaurants and to the movies and buy some Jordans, you know? But like I said, I don't think that's where happiness is really found anyway. Anyway, that's a nice tangent. So yeah, next time, let's talk about this animal rights and evolution. That'll be an interesting subject. You will be surprised by some of the things that were going on at this time. It was like an awakening. So that's it for this episode. I hope that kind of paints a picture for you on what Theodore Roosevelt was like as a young boy, his obsession for animals, the museum. A lot of his artifacts are now in museums. He donated them. I think some things are at Harvard University, and these things can be seen still today. But it's a testament to the type of man that he was, that these things are not things he's faking, right? Like there is a driving passion that he has for the outdoors and for nature and for God and country that is pretty impressive and propels him throughout his life. So anyway, that's it for today. Thanks for tuning in. Stay gritty.